Hi, welcome to my workshop. Today we're going to build two kits, a farmhouse and a section house. These are both laser kits from American model builders. And we're going to move fast to get through both of these kits. This shows the farmhouse and this shows the section house. Both of these kits I've built in the past. We'll start with the section house. The kit consists of laser cut walls, laser cut windows and doors, and shingles. So first I lay all the parts of the kit out, and I have my previously built one to use as a reference. The base is comprised of two parts that get glued onto the base. These form the floors of the building. The next thing I did was brace all of the walls. These were going to have paint and stain on them, and I didn't want them to warp on me. Then I picked my colors. In this case it's going to be a saddle brown and a buttermilk for the trim. I first started dry brushing on my saddle brown, leaving some areas not fully covered. Then I started to glue my walls together, making sure everything was square. Once I had two L sections made, I could join those two together, and I glued and clamped them. Then I had the main building and the back extension ready to put onto the base. Then I started dry brushing my trim. I then glued the two buildings onto the base, and you can see that I added a second floor and a couple of dividing walls. Now I started to paint the porch trim and the doors. I started putting together the doors. Most of the trim is peel and stick, which goes on easily. Next I applied Hunter Line driftwood stain to the building, and this filled in the unpainted areas and made them look worn. I then started working on the front porch and putting some of the trim on. Putting together the windows took a while, but all of it being peel and stick, they went together fairly easily. I then glued them all in place and turned my attention to the shingles. I took them to my spray booth and airbrushed them with a couple different shades of grays. Then I started applying the shingles onto the roofing. Again, being peel and stick, these went on pretty easily. I did the back extension and then started putting the shingles onto the main roof. Once the back extension roofs were glued in place, I applied a ridge cap to where they met. Then, after trimming off the ends of the shingles on my main roof, I glued those into place on the main building and added the ridge cap to that as well. Where the roofs met left a small little gap on the ends, so I filled those with plastic putty, and after that dried and I sanded it down, I came back and painted over it. The next step was to finish applying all of the trim. This included the corner trim and the trim underneath the roof on the gable ends. Next, I had to do a little work on the metal cast chimneys. They needed a little bit of cleanup. So once I did that, I then spray painted them with a dull red. While that was drying, I put all of the porch supports onto the building. Then once the chimneys were dry, I came back and I used a distress crayon to apply the mortar onto the chimneys. Sometimes I like using a distress crayon for mortar on brickwork. Then I glued the chimneys into place on the building, and I colored the tops of them with the gray paint. Then I went around the chimneys with some gallery glass leading. This was to simulate tar where the chimneys went through the roof. I was now at the point to weather the building. I like to use pigments for doing this, So I got out my selection and started weathering all around the building. And at that point, the section house was pretty much done. So now it was time to work on the farmhouse. And just like the section house, I had already built one of these previously. When you lay out all the parts, you can see this kit's a little more involved than the previous one. But all the parts are made the same, with peel and stick trim. But this one had come with pre-warped walls. I guess they had been in the box for a while. So I knew I was going to have to put bracing onto these walls even before I started putting the building together. I used my Ultimation slicer to cut the bracing to fit onto the walls. Then I glued all of the bracing in places where they weren't going to interfere with the windows or any planned walls that I put inside it. This farmhouse was getting a pistachio dry brushed onto the walls. And then once I finished it, I started covering it with a hunter-line driftwood. And just like on the section house, I had cut ends for the clapboard and distressed a few of the boards, which showed up so well after it was stained. I also gave the inside rooms a little bit of color that you'd be able to see through the windows. Then I airbrushed the trim and the window outer trim with a burnt umber. And then I used a sponge to apply the pistachio to some of the other trim, including the inside of the windows. And this shows how the windows would go together with the outer trim brown and the inner trim the pistachio color. I had used my sanding stick to do a little bit of distress onto the wood trim. And I started putting the windows together. Being peel and stick like before, they went together pretty easily. And I glued all of the windows into place once I was done with them. This farmhouse was going to have a lot of curtains in it, so I had printed out some of the curtain files that I had. And then I'd cut them apart and put them in the rooms and hold them in place with a liquid PSA. You have to make sure that the curtains match the rooms that they're going in. Then I started to glue my walls together, again putting together two L shapes. Once I had all of my pieces ready to put together, I could glue them and clamp them into one structure. Unlike the section house, the farmhouse didn't come with any kind of base or flooring, so I used some 1/16 inch basswood and just cut a floor out of it that would fit inside. I had left room at the bottom of my bracing so that a floor would be able to fit inside. It would be on the bottom of the building and wouldn't be quite up at where the floor level would be, but it would still help hold the building together, and you wouldn't be able to see through the windows that there was no floor. I also used a piece of balsa wood and cut a second floor that I had to notch around the bracing. So I glued the balsa wood in place. Now it was time to start applying a lot of the trim onto this building. It had more trim than the section house did. But again, they all went on nicely being peel and stick. It had the usual corner trim and the trim under the roof on the gable ends. Then I made up a couple interior walls for both the first floor and second floor out of pieces of cardboard, and I painted them to match the rooms they were going to go into. I then glued them in place. And the ones on the first floor, after I glued them in, I then glued the floor into the bottom of the building. Now I started painting all of the porch trim again using a sponge with the pistachio. I also painted the top section of the porch and the steps in a gray paint. Then I started putting the porch together. You had the porch base and the upper roof supports. Then they have all this nice trim. Some of it is peel and stick, and some of it gets glued in place. So I glued and clamped some of the upper braces in place. And then they had peel and stick pieces that went on to give them some relief. Then the lower lattice work was put together out of multiple pieces, again being peel and stick. And then once they're done, they get glued in place underneath the porch. Then I put together the pieces of the railings and glued them in place on the porch supports. Next I started adding the supports for the steps. They go in the front, the side, and the back of the building. And then I started on the roofing. I had painted the roofing material with a primer red, and it's also peel and stick. And I stick the pieces onto the roof that goes over the kitchen. Then you have these small strips that you put in place, and they end up representing the seams in the standing seam roof. Once I was done with it, I glued it in place over the kitchen. And then I started on the porch roof. And it went together in the same way. And like the back porch, after I had applied the strips that represented the seams, I trimmed the ends off of them. And then I glued the porch roof in place. I had glued the two main roof pieces together. They had some supports that go inside. And I applied the roofing to the main roof, the same way I did for the other roofs. And then it had a piece that got attached to the ridge. Then I went around the base of the kit with a murky brown stain to represent decay. The kit came with parts where you could make up an entrance to a cellar. So I put these together, and then I used gouaches to represent rust stains running down the sides and the doors, as these would be metal. Then, like before, the kit came with metal chimneys, and after I spray painted them a dull red, I used spackling this time to represent the mortar, as these mortar lines weren't as deep. Then after they were done, I glued them in place inside the holes on the roof. And at that point, I glued the roof onto the building. And once again, one of my favorite parts is weathering a model. I used artist pigments as before. I have a series of brushes and a lot of different shades that I can apply in different ways. And at that point I was done with the farmhouse as well. Both of these kits, the farmhouse and the section house, were going to a customer of mine to go onto his layout. And even though I've done them before, I still enjoy putting together these A and B kits. They go together well. So I took both kits outside to a park near me to get some photos of them in the sun, which really highlights the colors. I want to thank you again for watching my channel and hope you come back to see more videos.